Tonight's program is being videotaped by CAN TV, the Chicago Access Network, and recorded by WBEZ as a part of Chicago Amplified. Chicago Amplified is a web-based audio library of diverse educational events recorded throughout the Chicago region. You will be able to hear this program again, recommend it to friends and colleagues, or hear other interesting and informative public programs by going online to wbez.org/amplified. And to introduce tonight's program, I'm very pleased to welcome Robert Lorzell, President of the Society of Midland Authors.
That's great. Thank you all for coming out tonight for what I hope will be an interesting and fascinating discussion on the legacy of the man this building is named after, Harold Washington. But first, I wanted to say just a few words about the Society of Midland Authors. We're a nonprofit group for published authors in 12 Midwestern states. We started in 1915, so we're almost 100 years old. Some of our early members included Jane Addams and Hamlin Garland and Clarence Darrow, just to name a few. And many years later, Dempsey Travis was our president, and I think there's a copy of his book on the table there about Harold Washington. You can find out more information about our group at our website, midlandauthors.com. One of the things we do is we hold several programs a year, literary events where the public is welcome to attend. And usually we meet over at the Cliff Dwellers Club, but they are closed temporarily for renovations. So for the next few months, the Harold Washington Library has graciously agreed to host our events, and we are very grateful that they are doing this. We will be back here in this same library at 6 p.m. Wednesday, February 13th, for a talk by Gillian Flynn, who is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Gone Girl. And then on Tuesday, March 12th, also at 6 p.m., Jerry Souter will be here to talk about his book, American Shooter, A Personal History of Gun Culture in the United States. But tonight the topic is Harold Washington, who was elected as Chicago's first black mayor 30 years ago. The campaign was underway in 1983, right at this time of the year. And here is our panel of experts. I will start over on the far end of the table there. That's Mr. Salim Muwakkil, Chicago writer, a host on WVON, and he's the author of a book called Harold, Photographs from the Harold Washington Years. He wrote the text for the book, and it features photographs by Antonio Dickey and Mark Pokempner. And next to him is Peter Nolan, a former reporter for NBC Channel 5, among other media outlets. And he wrote a book that came out about a year ago called Campaign, the 1983 Election That Rocked Chicago. And next to him is Mr. Timuel Black, who's the author of Bridges of Memory, a 2-volume history of Black Chicago. And he tells me a 3rd volume is on the way soon, as well as his memoir, which should be coming out in the next few months. And that's something anyone who's interested in Chicago will eagerly anticipate. And then finally, on the end here, is Robert Starks, the founder of the Harold Washington Institute for Research and Policy Studies at Northeastern Illinois University. Professor Starks is not an author of a published book yet, but he tells me he's working on a book about Harold Washington. And he will be our moderator tonight, and I will turn over the discussion to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for coming tonight, and I must say, parenthetically, that I'm glad we're not at the Cliff Dwellers Club, because with the fiscal cliff, I don't want to fall off the edge tonight. So, this is a very special night for me because we have 3 very important people who know about the campaign, who can tell us some of the things that were inside that have never really been published. And what we'd like to do is put out about 3 questions and allow each one of our panelists to respond to those questions, and then open it up for questions and answers from the audience. The first question I'd like to ask the panelists is, how were you connected to the Harold Washington campaign? And secondly, what was your participation in that campaign? And lastly, how do you evaluate the tenure of Harold Washington as mayor? Okay? And since we are going to take beauty before age, we will start with Mr. Tim Black.
Oh.
You may sit.
Yeah. I knew Harold Washington from Roosevelt College, it was then, and from that point on, a little background, of course, to give some knowledge or feelings about the climate and the environment. Harold Washington's family were part of the first great migration of African Americans to Chicago. And Harold very early became politically involved because of his father. When I met him, after both of us had served in World War II at Roosevelt, he was already a political active person. I was older, but I was like the big brother to those activists at Roosevelt College, which later becomes Roosevelt. And so it was relatively easy because of our friendship when he entered politics first as an active person of the Democratic political party, the Young Democrats, and then when we persuaded him to run for state representative, where he was a very active person. He was so active, and I'll cut it short because of the time, that he was the person who introduced the idea when Dr. King was assassinated, that his memory should be continued every year on the date of his birth. That now is relative nationwide. When he won that spot, then later, some years later, he was persuaded, we persuaded him, Bob Starks was one of those and others, to run for Congress, to fill a vacancy which had been created by the death of Ralph Metcalf. And so he did, and in the Congress, in his first term, because of his personality and his sophistication, he became a leader of the Democratic Party and lobbied and won for the extension of the Voter Rights Act for another 10 years. Because of that, he was admired and revered in the Congress on both sides of the aisle. And then there were those of us who had helped to elect Jane Byrne, who didn't do so well towards the community that helped elect her. And a statement came out by Lou Palmer that when the election, we shall see in '83. And so we began to organize for that purpose. And were able to convince Harold, because of the resources that we accumulated, that he should leave the Congress where he was revered, come home, and run to be the first African-American mayor in the history of this city. It was a successful venture. And I'll stop right there because I could talk on and on and on. But the other panelists have much more to offer. So I'll stop right there and we'll come back later for other things.
Okay. Mr. Nolan?
I forgot the questions already.
I did too, likewise.
No, I got one of them.
Well,
No, I'm only kidding. I think I got it.
okay.
The connection to the Harold Washington campaign. I just want to say, I met Harold Washington in Springfield. I was covering the legislature, and it's probably around, I'm going to say around 1970. He had been in the legislature, and he was the head of the Black Caucus, which was a brand new thing down there. It caused quite a big stir. But I remember interviewing someone who told me that they didn't have a lot of power in the beginning because many of the members had second jobs with the city through the organization, and they were causing trouble in Springfield, and some of their wives were getting phone calls from ward committeemen saying, you know, your husband's messing around with that second job. He's fooling with the income. But Harold was really a great personality. I also remember meeting him when some members of the Black Caucus in a bar and having a couple drinks with him. And in the campaign, the way we were set up at NBC in the primary election, I was assigned to cover Richard M. Daley, okay? And then, but the way we worked it, many times we were sent to the other candidates. I had covered City Hall, so I occasionally would cover Byrne. And on occasion, I covered Harold Washington during that campaign in the primary election. And the one event that I got sent to, I think it was my time to work, it was a Sunday night, was this rally at the University of Illinois Chicago Circle campus. It was just a fantastic thing. I remember looking at that audience. I think there were approximately 12,000 people there. They were there for 4 hours. Very few got up even to go to the bathroom. It was spellbinding. And so that was kind of my connection to the thing. And your question about Washington's tenure, in office, I think he was, you know, his hands were tied for about 4 years because of the white majority at the Verdoliak 29 on the city council. But as soon as that ended, which was near the end of his term, Harold began to get things done in a real reform-minded way, and which was, you know, he came up through the organization, and he had a change of course, I think, when he was still in the legislature, and before he died, he was able to put through some very important things. One of the things that I remember was opening up city work and contracts to people who were qualified rather than people who were somebody's buddy. So that's my thing about Harold.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Salim Muwakkil.
Good evening, all. I'm glad to be here, and I'm really gratified to see that there's still a lot of interest in the past that Harold Washington represented. He was a rare figure, and you know, I met him in the process of covering politics in Chicago and black politics in general in the country, and some of the trends in the black community and black activist community, and what was happening in what is generally and generically called the black movement. And Harold Washington was really a seminal figure in that, in a lot of ways. I first came in contact with him when I first came to Chicago, really, because it was, you know, right during the period when the original Mayor Daley was ailing, and he died, and Wilson Frost, who was the pro tem of the city council, was supposed to take a ceremonial job as a interim mayor, and he was prevented from doing that by intransigent members of the city council who didn't even want the symbolism of of a black man in the mayor's seat. And Harold Washington was a part of a black caucus, a legislative black caucus that came down to Chicago to express their anger at those developments. And I remember being extremely impressed by this guy who was leading it, the spokesman, who was Harold Washington. Until that time, I hadn't really been that impressed with Chicago politicians, especially the black politicians. They seemed to be lacking, I don't want to get too, but they were lacking, let's say. And Harold Washington completely confounded that stereotype. First of all, I heard him use the word Kafkaesque. I said, man, a Chicago politician with literary sensibilities, that was the first thing that attracted my attention to him. And so I kind of followed him after that, and he never really disappointed me. He demonstrated that breadth of intellectual experience and interest, and he was a whiz at the kind of nuts and bolts politics that characterize Chicago politicians. So he kind of embodied all of it. He was a weird composite in a lot of ways. He was very popular among the clergy, the black clergy, and black businessmen, as well as, and this is the most extraordinary thing, the black nationalist community, which was extremely important during that period in history. And the black nationalist community conferred a certain amount of racial legitimacy to any black figure who aspired to political office or any kind of larger aspiration. And the black nationalist community generally was very reticent to get involved in politics. They were very distrustful of politicians, but they embraced Harold Washington in a way that was extremely unusual. They embraced him. The white left embraced him. They found something attractive in his ideological understanding of certain kind of political movements and his reform credentials. And so he had this breadth of support that was unusual. When he was elected to Congress, it became clear that he was really someone who could transcend Chicago politics in a serious way. He was in great demand as a spokesman on the cerebral news stations, McNeil Lehrer Report and the Charlie Rose program, those kinds of programs that required a certain kind of intellectual gravitas. He had that. And he seemed to be moving away from the rough and tumble of Chicago politics. But then the folks in Chicago wanted him back, and they start calling him, "Come on back, Harold, come on back. We need you. There's a chance that we can get a black mayor, but we need someone with the stature to appeal to our constituents." And Harold had that kind of wide-ranging appeal, and it took a lot to convince him to come back. But eventually, he relented after he set up some high hurdles for his supporters to jump over, and they did it. And so he realized that people were serious, and the black community was serious. The black nationalists were behind him, and they had the community's spirit behind them. And so he came back and was, the rest is, as we say, history. And I was following him throughout all of that. And I really never disappointed with his tenure. His campaign was a hybrid of a crusade and a campaign, a civil rights crusade and political campaign that became a template for Jesse Jackson's 84 run for president and his 88 run. It became, that hybridized mechanism. And so he was an extraordinary figure and his stature grows larger the further we get away from his death, because we see just how important it was and how difficult it is to fill up his space. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to turn to Mr. Nolan for some particular answers. How did the white community, particularly those supporters of Jane Byrne, look at this whole campaign, the primary?
Well, I think the white community and the white committeemen saw Harold Washington as a threat. He was going to dismantle the patronage, which, they had lived in this feudal system for years and years, where the committeemen and the aldermen were the bosses of each neighborhood, and they had jobs to give out, and most of these people, they didn't want to mess with the status quo. And now then you had the general public. You had a city that there were, and I was witness to, there was a lot of racism in the city. People weren't going to, people, well, and elsewhere too. It wasn't just here in Chicago. You go anywhere and you can find it. But I think, but enough white people, not a lot, put that aside and voted. It was a small amount in that primary election, but there was
59,000.
Yeah.
That was about 49%.
12%, I think they said, was undecided, and that Harold got those votes. But that's, basically, it wasn't, I don't think the gentleman mentioned this, but it wasn't total racism. It wasn't total, because many of these people were worried about, Studs Terkel, I think, was the one who said a lot of these people were hard-working people. There was fear in the way. They didn't know, what was going to happen. And that's how I think they viewed it in the primary. And I was on a radio show with Rick Hogan not too long ago where he read the Mike Royko column the next day where he said, opened up by saying, "Don't worry, Uncle Chester, Harold Washington isn't going to marry your daughter," after the election. So everything, Harold Washington got in, and what happened? He could manage the city government. There was no, and that's how I think the way. I think it's basically, it usually is fear. They're scared of change.
One other question, since you were in the news media at that time, I distinctively remember the news media, for the most part, dismissed Harold Washington and the black movement and didn't really take him seriously until probably halfway through the primary.
I think you're absolutely right. I think they felt, there's going to be another. Harold had run in 1977.
Yeah, exactly.
And he only got, I think, 11% of the vote. And
Right.
I know that there were a lot of people in doing the research for my book in the black community who didn't really come around till that first debate when they saw
Right,
him on
precisely.
television and said, "Hey, this guy can do it. This guy is for
yes,
real."
yes.
The media didn't. I think NBC, we covered him pretty good, though.
I think you did.
We had a guy who's no longer with us, Paul Hogan, who was on that campaign quite a bit. And he got plenty of coverage. But I think you're right. I don't think the media, until near the end, till that.
Of the first or the second? Of the first campaign or the second?
The primary election I'm
Primary,
talking about,
Right.
The second one is kind of different because now you have just what I refer to as you got the white guy against the black guy. Now that you talk, now the racism really comes into focus.
Full force, right.
The circle,
Before it's too late?
Right.
the circle demonstration, or when was that protest, that big rally in Illinois? That was when the media, I think, began to look very seriously.
seriously.
That's
at
what
Harold.
I did.
But I know a lot of,
Well,
but I
people
think you're right.
came to that rally from all over the country.
That's right.
All over the country, and sometimes even across other parts of the world. And when I was going to Argentina, for example, they were already wondering whether we could elect in Chicago a black person to be mayor.
It was big news, no doubt about it.
Let me just tell you a little quick story about that first debate. Center for Inner City Studies, Northeastern Illinois University, some friends of mine and I took Harold down in the basement where we had our meetings, Task Force for Black Political Empowerment, and said, well, let's give you some pointers as if we were so great about how to deal with this debate. And we gave him pointers, but we told him, look, why don't you use the old adage from Joe Louis, you can run, but you can't hide. And he went, that was a knockout punch in that debate. And after that, I mean, the whole place went up because we had a viewing party. And then we had to go on the radio and call in and decide who won the debate. And of course, we stacked up everything. We had 5 phones and we called 15 times each person. And it came out to NBC that Harold had won. But I think you're absolutely correct. That first debate was a big boost for the Harold Washington campaign because he was intelligent and he, of course, demonstrated his knowledge of government. And he did not scare the employees who thought they were going to lose their jobs.
And as you pointed out, Mr. Starks, he had the support of a very serious black nationalist community, which was a very unusual thing. A lot of people don't realize today, with the kind of racialized politics that we have, that at one point, Chicago was really the headquarters of black nationalist America. And that they conferred a kind of, as I say, a kind of legitimacy on any aspiring politician. And they had the grassroots fervor that could get the street heat going on. And this was a very unusual thing, and Harold embraced that, which is something which was also unusual. Most politicians ran away from black nationalism as if it was some sort of plague, and Harold embraced it, but while embracing it, he didn't alienate other constituencies at all.
Another factor was that we kept Jane Byrne and Daley in the debate.
Yes.
They split each other.
They sure did.
In terms of the support, as the people who were their support split because they didn't know which way to go, and Harold, his base was solid.
Right.
And so in that debate, he won that debate, and after that, there was just no contest.
No contest.
Because he could whip any of the rest. But that first debate was a deciding point. And it's very important to ask, is why in a city that is democratic in terms of the politics, that even in the general election, after the primary, in the first election, Harold only won by a very narrow margin, though he received 90%, we registered somewhere around 89% of all eligible African Americans and a good number of Latinos. Harold, in a democratic city that, I don't mean behaviorally democratic, I mean in terms of title, that he only won by something like 49,000, where Jane Byrne previously in a similar contest, once she had won the primary, she won overwhelmingly, which gives some idea of how great Harold was, because when I was riding a bus with a bus driver, I stopped driving a long time ago, the bus driver and most of the black, he said, anyone not gonna vote for Harold Washington, get off my bus. And everybody laughed because a little girl on another bus said that would give you some sense of the depth of the black interest in the possibilities. And the little girl was saying to her mother, Mama, I know how to spell Harold Washington, the bus got quiet. She spelled it. Then she looked laughingly at her mother and said, but I don't know how to spell Jane Byrne. And everyone laughed. And the enthusiasm was so deep in the black community that if you didn't have on a Harold Washington button, you were not well dressed. But still, with all of that support, in the first election, the general election, he did not win by a big majority. And then we move into the area of his first term. That's another story that needs to be told too, Bob.
Yes, absolutely. Listen, I think, Salim, you raise a great point. And I think at that point, we have to look at the role played by Lou and Georgia Palmer,
Yep.
who were somewhat overlooked in many of the writings. But they played a very, very important part in the Harold Washington campaign because they had had a relationship with him long prior to, going all the way back to the 77 campaign where he lost. But of course, the reason he was in the 77 campaign in the first place was they were threatening to throw him out of the party. And he used the 77 campaign as a way of showing the party that he had strength, even though he lost. And then he comes back again in 82 and 83.
Now, see, these kinds of strategic machinations are unknown to most people.
Exactly.
Mr. Starks,
Precisely.
glad that you could inform us. That's a very good point. You know that he had to reestablish his bona fides.
Precisely. Because he was a rebel within the
Right.
party.
No, absolutely.
He was a rebel within the party. And the night that he announced that he was going to run, we had a meeting at the Center for Inner City Studies with my little group of bandits. He called us the Mau Mau group because we were the
Sure did.
we were the nationalists, and we worked out a plan that we called the 80-80 plan. If we said that we could win if 80% of the black vote had an 80% turnout and 80% of them actually voted for Harold. We didn't exactly make that, but the point that Tim made is that his vote was solid. And that's what made it so good, and that's why we were so happy that Byrne and Daley stayed in the race. And of course, that was the bone of contention for many in the white community because they turned against Daley, at least at that point, because he in their minds, messed up Byrne's chance of winning.
And that was toward the end of the campaign when Verdoliak made the comment to precinct captains that this is going to be the end of our city as we know it. It was really racially charged. It was like a bomb going off. And it was played on television, on the radio, all the time for the last week of the campaign or toward the very end. And that's when the dynamics of this whole thing changed because really Jane Byrne, I believe they wanted a black candidate in the race in the beginning because she thought the real threat was from Daley.
That's right.
And all the early polls showed Daley could knock her off.
That's right.
And so they were anxious. And I believe that's the reason she took some black people off the school board and the Chicago
CHA,
Housing
right,
Authority just
exactly.
to get the pot boiling a little bit. And this is what happened.
That's
But little
when
did she
it
know
boiled over, right?
about the 80.
88, right.
And I remember being in the City Hall press room when Alderman Burke, who was not a Herald supporter,
Not in any sense.
and he said, this could, with this registration, he was looking at the numbers. He said, Harold could have a chance. This was early on, and but again, everybody says, no, that's not going to happen, but it did.
Yeah. Well, I remember distinctively a political scientist from Loyola, I've forgotten his name, said in effect on radio, and he's written a couple of columns in a newspaper, saying in effect that Harold was a put-up and that he was not really
There's
serious.
a lot of people thought that too. They always have a third candidate in there.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, Bob, you remember Lou Palmer and Georgia, since you mentioned them, were having those meetings
Exactly.
weekly, and we had to draft Harold.
Exactly. We had to
And
convince
we
him
had
to
to
run.
draft, not only organize Harold, because Lou Palmer had, because of the insults that we felt about Jane Byrne's behavior when we had elected Jane Byrne. She would have lost had it not been for big turnout.
Point out, Tim, the fact that you were one of her major supporters in the liberal
Absolutely.
community.
Absolutely. Me and what's your name from the University of Illinois, political science.
Yeah. Simpson.
Yeah, yeah. And we couldn't even get to see her in the city hall when we went up. And so that was what stimulated Lou,
Exactly.
because Lou had dropped out of politics, you may remember, because he didn't think blacks would ever be getting anywhere in in the United States. And that revived him after the insults of eliminating blacks from the school board and CHA.
Right.
And then you remember the
boycott of Chicago.
Boycott of Chicago
boycotts where, what's his name from, well, Jesse, for one thing,
Jesse pushed
was
it.
able to talk Stevie Wonder
Out of
coming and participating in that,
Right.
the summer event.
Right.
And that
Chicago
Lou
Fest.
Palmer
Chicago,
said,
yeah.
Lou Palmer created, say, we shall see, this is 82.
In 83.
In 83. And we began to organize. Harold he was doing so well. Now we had to organize. Bob Starks organizing all those young people at Center for Inner City Studies. And I'm trying to organize all those old folks from everywhere else, white and black. And so Harold wasn't sure that he wanted to run, and he made a demand that we register certain number of people and raise some money.
Right. Right.
And we went to Ed Gardner, who organized the money black community, and that gave us the registration. We registered hundreds of thousands, 263,000, I think, in that short period of time. And then the money came. And that's when we were able to say to Harold, what you gonna do now, man? And he laughed and said, I think I gotta run. And made that public announcement that stirred up more feeling among all people, not just among all liberals, not just African Americans, but liberals in general, because one of his opposition people happened to be somewhat liberal, Republican, Jewish. Now we had to help our Jewish friends know that we were running a race that was liberal beyond just the issues, but also that it would be more meaningful if an African American liberal was to be the candidate and the victor. So much of the liberal Caucasian or Jewish community perhaps backed Harold against a Jewish, relatively well-known person who was running in the general election.
Bernard Epton.
Bernard Epton.
Right. Now, point out, Tim, the fact that you headed up the voter registration campaign for Harold's campaign.
That was one of the assignments that I couldn't refuse. And so that was the way in which we, and then the head of the Afro-American Patrolmen's League,
Renault Robinson.
Renault Robinson.
was very, very important in that.
Now, Salim, could you sort of talk a little bit about the role that Slim Coleman played in this, which sort of represented the white left in this whole campaign?
Yeah, I mean, again, that was one of the unique things about Harold Washington is that he appealed to the white left, as Tim points out, the Jewish left, which was strong in Chicago in certain, especially Hyde Park area.
With Bernie Epton.
Bernie Epton.
Bernie Epton. Bernie was a liberal.
He was a progressive Republican when that wasn't an oxymoron. And so Slim represented another element of that left, that white left, what we used to call what they call in the Black Panther Party the Mother Country Radicals. He was one of the you know, waspish kinds of leftish,
Yeah,
leftist
on the north side.
on the north side.
Harvard graduate.
Harvard grad, and he brought that credibility to Harold's campaign. And so it was as I say, it was not only a hybrid in terms of how it merged political know-how with activist energy, it also was a hybrid in how it merged black nationalist politics, you know, my turn politics, with a reform orientation that the left brought to it. And so, again, he was a unique composite. And for me, what he did is he reinforced this notion of the great man theory in politics, the notion that has really faced hard times lately. People have kind of dismissed this notion of the great man. It's the movement. It's the people that create the man, not the other way around. But hey, without Harold Washington, I doubt very seriously if this movement would have caught on. And without him, we see what happened. Yeah. So I think Harold, you know, reinforced this notion that it takes a unique and extraordinary personality to manifest the promise of a movement.
Well, one of the things that, again, we'd like to point out is the fact that Mr. Obama saw the potential of Chicago as a result of the Harold Washington election, as well as Jesse Jackson seeing the potential in running for the presidency in '84 and '88.
As well as Carol Moseley Braun.
Precisely.
Running for U.S. Senate.
And the continuity is personnel deep when it comes to Obama and Harold. I mean, and many of the same people who were involved in Harold Washington's campaign were involved in Barack Obama's campaign in the beginning, and even now.
Right.
Slim Coleman, I remember, was a real community activist.
Absolutely.
He was, Harry Golden, the Sun-Times reporter at the press room, he's a communist. He's a communist. Of course, everybody was a communist if you were, but Slim Coleman was a real genuine community.
Genuine.
He had this Texas drawl, and he was at City Hall a lot of the time. Pleading his case to the media, and what was wrong. He was based in Uptown, I think, and he really organized a lot of.
Who was his lady friend who
Helen
became
Schiller.
alderman?
Helen Schiller was an alderman, and he's now. I saw him on.
He's
a minister.
He's a minister. He's got a collar. He's an ordained minister with some church, but he
Still
was
involved.
He was
Still involved in the
I liked
struggle.
him.
Right.
Slim Coleman. He was a character.
Salim, also, what role did the Hispanic community play in this whole?
Oh, very, very, very important. Because the Hispanic community had been fractured between, Puerto Rican and Mexican forces. There had a strong rivalry. And Harold united as well as, one of the things that Harold was noted for, and that is its kind of multicultural outreach in which he pulled people together. Some of the most important aspects of his appeal was he pulled the black community together, and not only did he unite black politicians with Latino politicians, but he united the Latino community in a way that it hadn't been, and Asians as well. But there was serious division between Puerto Ricans and Mexican forces, and Harold Washington helped reconcile those divisions.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
He also, I really believe too that after he got elected, he brought together all, I don't know, we call them radical groups, or the national movement, but then the Hispanic groups. He could bridge all, and then he would get back to the organization type people. He could work with them. I remember, and I won't use his name, but a man told me who was a Byrne supporter, and he was a lawyer, served with Harold in the legislature, and this is after Harold was elected. He had a client that wanted some business at O'Hare Airport, and he went up to see Harold with the client, and Harold, he said, just charmed the pants off of everybody, and he said, my client thought I was God after, so he was that kind of a guy. He could bring everybody together.
On the national level, he was
respected on the national
particularly in the South African issue.
That's right.
Where we were able to convince him to go, what is the name of the money?
The Krugerrand.
The Krugerrands, yeah.
That what was that How did he do that, Bob? Do you remember?
I don't recall the exact slogan that we had, but he was also supportive, of course, in the '84 campaign that we started with the march in front of the consulate, South African consulate,
Yeah.
and also supported the '86 ban on trade with South Africa.
That's right, that's right.
And at the national level, and of course at the international level. Whenever I traveled to Europe, the first thing people would say to me is, "How is Harold?" And of course he adopted, I told him about that. So he said in one of his speeches, "Everywhere you go, they want to know, how is Harold?" Never forget that. Yes. Yes. Our time is, time for some questions. Questions and answers? Microphone here, okay? We get a little wrapped up in this whole thing, so please.
Oh, we were there doing it. Do it.
You folks are very informative, because I sat there and didn't say nothing. Right, for what, 45 minutes? Anyway, my name is Lowell Thompson, and I wrote this book, African Americans in Chicago. And I've got a picture in this book that relates to this. I'm not just grandstanding, it's related. I've got a picture of Harold Washington in the Riviera in Uptown, where I live now, with a young girl, looks like she's about maybe 8 years old. And when I was working on this book, I was talking to a guy at Starbucks in Uptown, white guy. And I mentioned I was doing the book. He says, "Well, if you're doing this book, you gotta have this picture." So he got this picture for me of his daughter in the Riviera in Uptown when Harold was running the first time. And guess who took the picture? Anybody?
David Axelrod.
Who? They mentioned the person. Helen Schiller.
Okay.
Well,
Thank
all
you.
right.
Thank you, man.
One of the things that you might want to tell the audience, of course, is that Harold had several groups supporting him. The Artists for Harold Washington, the Writers for Harold Washington. And I never will forget, Verdoliak, of course, he was always good at quipting. And he said on radio after the Harold Washington won the primary, he said he won because he had all those drunks and prostitutes supporting him.
And let me say also, while I had this opportunity, the man who was just at the microphone was a part of the vibrancy of Chicago, a great advertising executive, Lowell Thompson, who in many ways exemplified the movement, the independent political movement that Harold came out of. Lowell was a part of that atmosphere, and so he really, he's an unsung hero as well. And so I think I feel it my duty to point out his role in making Chicago such a vibrant community and a place that Harold could come from.
Right. And you were a part of the Artists for Harold, is that correct?
Right.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is
Wait a
Pat Michalski, and I campaigned for Mayor Washington on the northwest side of Chicago.
Excellent.
My husband Harry and I, and many other friends. And I wound up being Harold's assistant press secretary for the Ethic and Community Press. My question is, do you think the major press were fair to the mayor and give him fair coverage?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear
Do you
that.
feel the major press was fair in covering Mayor Washington? Did they, because I know I mailed out the press releases, and I know.
Well, I was part of the thing, so I know, but I thought they were pretty fair. I thought they gave Harold a lot of time. There was, I remember there was a lot of stuff going on. They had, do you remember the incident at the Catholic Church,
Yes,
St.
yes.
Pascal's?
Yes, yes.
And
A cardinal was the pastor at that time at that church.
That's right.
Do not forget that.
No, well, I don't know if the cardinal was out there, had been out there for, I don't know if he was the pastor of that church, but Cardinal Bernardine had met with the pastor. the night before and said, you can't, you've invited candidates to come here, but I don't want to get into that whole thing, but the media covered that pretty well, and I think Harold's campaign wanted to use some of that tape of these nasty crowd out there shouting at Harold and Walter Mondale. And they actually, the media said you can't use that film. They put it on the air, and a couple of stations took it off. But in general, I think I thought Harold got a fair shot in the media. I'm trying to think.
I'm talking about after he was mayor, when he was trying to get the information to the press.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'll say this: Verdoliak and the Verdoliak 29, they were somewhat influential with the media and trying to knock. Of course, the media is always trying to knock down politicians. Once you get into office, they want to punch him out a little bit.
But they weren't putting out the information he was given to him that he wanted to tell what he's trying to do and so forth, you know.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
why he turned to the ethnic and community press, because he felt.
Well, you know who perfected that years back was the first Mayor Daley. He went out to the little local papers in the neighborhoods, and he had a real good network. And I didn't realize that, as you're telling me, that Harold used that too.
I had set up a press conference with the ethnic press, the community press, and the mayor walked in, and in 5 minutes, he had all these people just eating out of his hand. They just adored him. And
Yeah.
He grabbed the, Chinese, the Polish, and the Lithuanian, all the different press, and he won them over in no time.
Now,
I
you were
remember
in the
you
press
mentioned about
office
ethnic
downtown?
outreach. I remember the big Assyrian rallies and all the rallies out in the ethnic communities. He said open sesame. It was.
Harold, talking about the neighborhood things, I mentioned this to somebody before. I went to a dinner when he was mayor, and one of his supporters was Bill Lipinski out in the 23rd Ward. And I got invited to this dinner out there. It was out on Archer Avenue in a hall. And I went out there and watched Harold dance in the polka with these Polish women. And I mean, it was great.
And interesting, I saw him dancing with Celia Cruz.
Yeah, that was.
In
That
Latino
was big.
community, Puerto Rican community. So he was a multicultural dancer
He
as
was
well.
truly he was a universal character.
Indeed.
That could have made that adjustment and be liked by the way in which he did it.
Right. Once I was beating him up about his weight. So he says, I go to every restaurant. I go to a Polish restaurant. I go to Chinese restaurants. And he would do that. He would go to all the restaurants. He knew people in Chinatown, on the northwest side, the southwest side, southeast side, all over. And he said, it's hard for me to keep my diet as a result of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I was not really interested in politics when I was younger, but even I was aware of the whole Council Wars era.
Yes.
And I am now currently struck by the similarities between what happened then and what's going on in Washington now. I'm very frustrated. And I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts as to what our current president should have learned from Washington's administration, or could still take from that could make a difference now.
But interesting you should make that point. It's because I raised the point when I was outlining some notes for this particular event. And how, two things. First, that first debate that we talked about earlier, how once African Americans saw the president, saw Harold Washington succeed in that debate against these two white candidates, they said, this brother could do it. And the environment changed. The same thing with Barack Obama, with the Iowa primary. Once he won the Iowa primary, and people say, hey, white people will vote for this brother. Because until then, most of the black electorate were for Hillary Clinton. They were aligning with her because were familiar with her. Barack Obama was a new face, so they didn't really know. But once he won that, boom. And also, and the other similarity was Council Wars, with the kind of obstructionism that the president has faced in the Congress. And also, this ties into the question about the media. The media has been reluctant to note how race is influencing the Tea Party response to the president. Rather, we find all other reasons to attribute to this kind of opposition, this intransigence that we find, unique and completely unprecedented intransigence. And I think that there seems, it seems clear that racial animus, or at least demographic anxiety, let us say, is at work here.
Very good way of putting it, Mr. Muwakkil.
People wouldn't make that point. They wouldn't make that point during Harold's tenure either. During council wars, there was a reluctance in the media to pin the tail on the donkey, so to speak. Or, well, I won't say that. There was a reluctance to point to racism where racism clearly was manifest.
Well, Harold gave inspiration to other black politicians because he activated, in a sense, something that Eisenhower said when we were losing during World War II. See, I'm old enough to have been in World War II. And Eisenhower, we were losing in North Africa. Eisenhower was appointed to be the general of the Allied forces, at least American Allied forces. And Eisenhower said, the impossible, we do that immediately. The miraculous sometimes takes a little longer. And Harold represented in Chicago, because of the political nature of Chicago, after Daley was elected the first time, Richard J. Daley, that you could do the impossible. And that inspired other politicians, black and white, particularly younger people, all across the country. The impossible, you can do that immediately. When I've been out of the country lately with Obama, young people are looking at him as an inspiration. Now, I wrote a letter to him recently, I wish I had a copy that I could read to you, about some of the things and examples that he could follow. Washington being one, Roosevelt being another. Look back in history and see how people in your high position did the impossible. Now you have 4 years without restraints to prove the impossible can be done immediately, and we do need the impossible.
That's right.
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering how long the Broadening Act 29 obstructed Harold's progress in his first term, and how Harold, I know, he didn't charm me, certainly, but he did break the kind of stranglehold somehow. I'd be interested in your perception. As far as how he got the majority, it was the result of a court case on redistricting, or the changing of the lines of the wards every 10 years, like they changed the congressional districts, and he was able to elect a couple of, reverse that balance. And he got, and this was at the end of his first term. And then in the second term, he had some defectors who came back to him. But that's how it was the result of a federal court case.
Yeah. It was Luis Gutierrez's
That's right.
Election that really did the trick.
And we went over
to the
to
rally,
that ward.
and where they were fighting as to who was going to be the candidate. And Harold said, whoever wins at this debate and at this battle was my candidate for that seat. And Luis, of course, very feisty person, won the debate, brought his troops to the rally, and he became the alderman for that ward, and broke the the log jam in the city council.
Did Garcia win in that?
Garcia won also, right? Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Starks.
How are you, sir?
I'm doing quite well, thank you. You mentioned Lou Palmer's wife,
Georgia Palmer.
Georgia Palmer. Also, we cannot forget about women such as Nancy Jefferson,
Absolutely.
Marion Stamps, the
Absolutely.
impact that these women play. Could the panel expand on their contribution to Harold Washington campaign, please?
Excellent. Well, look, there were just, I mean, Harold could charm women.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And they loved him, starting again, as you say, with George and Lou Palmer, as well as Nancy Jefferson, and the lady from Playboy. What was her name? Playboy, Hugh Hefner's daughter was one of his supporters also. Christy Hefner.
Christy Hefner. Became his appointment to the Cultural Affairs.
Yes.
Harold Weissman.
Louise
Lois Weiss.
Lois
Lois
Weissman.
Weisberg.
Lois Weissman,
So he had women from all over, both Hispanic, white women, black women. They all came together under one umbrella called Women for Harold Washington. And they worked together under, and it was the first time you had that kind of cross-section
That's right.
of
That's
women
right.
working together, raising money. And that's the other thing that most people forget, is that those women raised an awful lot of money for the Harold Washington campaign.
That's right. Nancy Jefferson, Marion Stamps, Dorothy Tillman.
Dorothy Tillman.
These were activist black women, somewhat aligned to the nationalist community as well. So Dr. Starks is aware of that connection as well. And again, this was an unusual thing to have these very, very militant community activists so adamantly supportive of a political candidate. That was an unusual thing. I mean, Harold pulled it off.
Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Owen Lawson. During the
Great photographer.
Harold Washington leaders, I was a photojournalist with the Chicago Defender newspaper, and with other freelance.
They can't hear you.
Talk a little louder, brother.
During the Washington years and prior to his election, I was a photographer with the Chicago Defender and other community papers in the African American community. And I was probably responsible for Harold's picture getting in more community papers than any other photographer in the city of Chicago. I covered a lot of his events, and I've been in politics ever since. And one of the things I would say is if you had 10 people at a meeting, Harold would be there. And he was the only politician I can remember in all that period of time who never sent a representative out and said, I'm sorry, but Harold couldn't be here. He was that, connected with the grassroots. There's one aspect of his campaign or his legacy that hasn't been discussed, and that is his relationship with the nationalist community in a somewhat cloudy sense, because after he was elected, there were some people who felt perhaps he was too fair, in the sense that he did not give the African American community the percentage of largesse that was commensurate with their involvement in his campaign. So I was wondering if any of you would like to speak on that.
That's the third element of similarity with President Barack Obama. because we hear, there's a story I tell frequently. Is I had completed a story on a lot of disgruntled former supporters of Harold that was going to be published 2 days after Harold suddenly died. Needless to say, we scrapped the story, and it never was published, but I had interviewed many people who were angry at Harold Washington precisely for that reason, that he was too fair. He was not delivering the goods to the black community. After all, it was our turn. We had been deprived of these kinds of goods and services for so long, and many people expected Harold to right things. And he was more concerned with being fair. He said, I'm going to be fairer than fair. I'm going to be fair to you whether you like it or not.
That's exactly what he used to say.
And a lot of his black supporters didn't want him to be that fair. And very similar to what's happening with Barack Obama right now. Many in the black community are saying, "Hey, man, you know."
It's not just the black community.
Yeah, that's true.
Young people and women.
True. That is true. But I mean, but at the same, but you know, his identity, his racial identity, has provoked many of his followers to presume that he would be a little bit more favorite. His policies would exhibit more favoritism.
Well, I distinctly
If I could just, I was just going to a quick quote from Mike Royko, the Chicago motto, "Ubi est mea, where's mine?"
Right.
Pardon me for interrupting.
No problem. I distinctly remember Tim Black on television complaining about that very same thing, and you were heavily criticized for that, right, Tim? For criticizing Harold because he hadn't delivered as much as you thought he should have to the black community.
And the base was eroding. As you may remember, you guys had to revive that base. You remember that?
Yes.
You had to revive that base because it was eroding. It had expanded racially and ethnically, but was eroding, particularly in the base from which he started. Now, that makes his period, similar to what we have today. Never, unfortunately, hear the president talk about poor people.
That's right.
But he used to brag about that's where it started, in a sense. Argyle Garden, and so forth. And so, I don't want to go too far.
Well, Tim, we know you won't be invited to the White House.
I want him to be a good president.
That's right.
As we had to pressure, even at that point, Harold with his multiple racial background, we had to pressure, and because people around Harold became self-centered rather than community, then when Harold began to find that out, he began to have to do the work himself. And a Sunday before he died, I went over, we were having, and Jesus Garcia was the principal speaker, Chicago community, to defend the Bill of Rights, and said, man, why don't you get some rest? Some of us who started with him could not get through. And he said, why don't you call me, man? I couldn't. He had been so surrounded that communication from people like Bob Stark, Tim Black, and others couldn't get. And he was working himself, and that Thursday or Wednesday was when he dropped dead. Because he began to realize that he was being betrayed, in a sense, by the people that he thought he could trust and that he could manage. And they were being managed outside of what Harold wanted it to be.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm Beverly Cook. My question...
Beverly?
Yeah, I did. My question is, we know about the charisma, at least I've read the books, and I was hit there too, about the charisma of Harold Washington. But I'm a little bit more interested in the Behind the Throne movement, how you were able to mobilize all these different organizations who had, frankly, different ideologies and what they wanted to accomplish to come together for that huge voters turnout, voters registration. You talked about the women, you talked about the artists, you talked about the teachers, you talked about the preachers. Well, how were you able to pull all of those different personalities together to come together for this one moment in time?
Well, we worked very hard. and remember, this is pre-Facebook, pre-internet. So the major instrument as my friend just said, was the community newspapers. We went to every community newspaper that we could talk to in the African American community as well as in the other ethnic communities and asked them to cover the campaign, to push Harold Washington with photographs, with articles. We even wrote articles and editorials ourselves. We stayed on radio, and thank God for WVON and WJPC, which was the Johnson Publication Radio, and we preached every day, every minute we could get on the radio, pumping the issue, and it finally caught on. Salim, would you like to comment on that?
Right, I think that was a great part of it, and again, it was that energy from the grassroots, that street heat, that was so lacking in many political campaigns because the politicians had been so alienated from the community. They hadn't really activated the indigenous forces, so to speak, to be very excited about the campaign. And again, it was Harold Washington.
That's right.
He was a unique character.
That's right.
They don't come along every day. And in fact, they don't come along every 50 years. And we're beginning to see, we're beginning to feel that vacuum.
Right. And of course, we dramatized the inequities of Badoliak and Burke and Kelly and and Byrne, of course. We portrayed her as the witch of all witches. And we constantly pumped that out to the public, and people became, really pumped up about it.
Dr. Starks, I want to make one more point related to something you said that I just want to emphasize. In 1983, I was designing Shop Talk magazine for Soft Sheen.
Right.
I was working with Terry and Gary Gardner, and I remember when I wasn't involved in the political campaign directly. I remember when Ed Gardner, the father, was asked about financing and hoping to finance a campaign. And I remember the slogan they came up with was "Come Alive, October 5,
right.
Register to vote." And I remember from then on the distinct feeling that because of Ed Gardner and his involvement in the community and being a real a businessman but community person, that he transferred African American desire for curly hair into political power. And I would like to just emphasize that to other people who supposedly are about helping to enfranchise the public, that business people and decent business people can be very important. And Ed Gardner in particular put his money where his mouth was in that campaign.
That's right.
Yeah.
Good
He
point.
financed the early voter registration all the way.
Right. And he was persuaded in part by this gentleman sitting next to me, because they were grammar school schoolmates, right?
Yeah, but I didn't know he had that kind of money.
Thank you very much, and now we'll hear from our host from the library. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, esteemed panel. And speaking again, speaking for the Chicago Public Library, what better place to hold such a program than in the world's largest public library building, the Harold Washington Library Center. Thank you, Peter Nolan, Timuel Black, Salim Muwakkil, and Robert Starks. Thank you, Society of Midland Authors and Robert Lorzell, for helping create this program. We have been so pleased to host it. Our authors will be available in the lobby where books are still for sale. You can buy a book and have them sign their book out in the lobby. We hope you will join us again for the many upcoming programs that will take place here at the Chicago Public Library in the coming year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.